Welcome to The Explainer. You know, when we think about ancient Buddhist texts, we usually picture these exquisite, solemn, Pure Land aesthetics, right? We imagine completely serene monks and nuns meditating in perfect, uninterrupted tranquility. But if you scratch just beneath the surface of these ancient records, you're going to find something entirely different. You'll find highly relatable, beautifully chaotic human stories.
So what do ancient Buddhist nuns, active war zones, and petty roommate drama actually have in common? Honestly, it's a completely serious question, and the answer lies in the 10 recitations Vinaya, specifically Volume 45. See, this isn't just a dry religious text filled with mystical dogmas. It is a vibrant, deeply practical look at real sociological history. It's a fascinating record of a community literally just trying to figure out how to live together, survive, and thrive thousands of years ago.
All right, here's our roadmap for unpacking Volume 45 today. We're going to start with ancient rules in human drama, then look at navigating a dangerous world, pivot over to monastic roommate conflicts, explore the strict ordination path, and finally look at their lasting institutional blueprint. Let's dive right in.
Starting off with Section 1, Ancient Rules in Human Drama, and specifically the Pasitya offenses.
Here is what you really need to understand. The Vinaya functions almost exactly like an ancient book of case law. There was no supreme leader just inventing rules out of thin air. Instead, we see this really fascinating four-step legislative process repeat over and over again throughout the text. First, you have the incident, right? A nun acts out or makes a mistake. Second, the complaint. There's public outrage, either from lay people or other nuns, complaining about the behavior. Third is the interrogation. The matter is brought to the Buddha, who summons the community and directly asks the accused, "Did you actually do this?" And finally, when they confess, the Buddha establishes the precedent. A brand new rule is born. So the rules were born from real, on-the-ground events, not top-down decrees.
Now, these specific rules we're talking about are called pasitya. The text defines this as an offense that requires expiation. It's a transgression that, quote, burns, covers, and obstructs the path to enlightenment if it isn't confessed. So the absolute crucial takeaway here is that these offenses weren't just about arbitrarily punishing bad behavior. They were identified as highly practical barriers to spiritual progress and honestly to just maintaining harmony within the community.
Moving on to Section 2, Navigating a Dangerous World, War Zones and Travel.
Because beyond spiritual progress, the text was deeply, deeply concerned with physical survival. Traveling in ancient India was incredibly hazardous. Take Kings Pasenadi and Ajatasattu, for example. They were mobilizing massive armies. We're talking elephants, horses, chariots, and infantry just to suppress rebellions. In both of these instances recorded in the text, traveling nuns actually saw these armies. The senior nuns logically suggested taking a detour, but the younger nuns confidently refused. They basically thought, hey, the kings and their families respect Buddhism, no one's going to dare stop us. So they walked right into active military campaigns. Predictably, the frontline soldiers who were just mercenaries fighting for gold and silver could not have cared less about their religious status. They completely robbed the nuns and stripped them of their robes. And when the kings found out, they couldn't even get the robes back because the soldiers were just totally unmanageable. This led to a massive complaint, and the Buddha delivered a really harsh reprimand, saying, "How can one be called a bhikkhuni who travels in doubtful and dangerous places within the country?" This dramatic question firmly established a hard protective rule. Traveling in war zones or areas of political unrest became a formal Pachittiya offense. It was a rule designed specifically to physically protect the women of the order. Okay, so we have these grand life-or-death rules. But what happens when the conflict isn't an invading army, but literally the nun sleeping right next to you?
That brings us to Section 3, Monastic Roommate Conflicts, Guest versus Resident. It turns out shared living spaces really haven't changed much in thousands of years. Human nature is just brilliantly passive-aggressive. In one incident in the text, a guest nun arrives after a long journey. The resident nun says, "I'm exhausted, let's sleep." But the guest nun says, "No way, I need to meditate and chant." She lights a lamp and keeps the resident up all night long. And the text shows the exact reverse happening too. A guest arrives completely exhausted from traveling, just begging to sleep without a lamp, and the resident spitefully declares that sleeping has no reward and intentionally lights a lamp to meditate and chant out loud all night just to annoy the guest. They basically had to invent a strict rule against resident monastics deliberately annoying guest monastics and vice versa.
But the drama wasn't just indoors. The community was heavily reliant on public support, which meant public perception was literally everything. Take the nun Kala. She is to sneak off early in the morning to visit heavenly shrines, music halls, and art galleries. The lay people were totally outraged. They complained, "She goes to look at art galleries like a woman of another sect." They obviously expected nuns to be way above worldly entertainment. Her actions jeopardized the public trust, which resulted in a strict rule against visiting those kinds of places.
We also see some really deep-seated institutional drama and, well, clique behavior. The nun Thilanenda is a frequent rule-breaker in this text. In one instance, she openly refused to stand up and welcome the highly respected senior monk Mahakassapa when he arrived at a house she was visiting. And why? Because he had a Brahmin past, and she didn't respect that lineage. This sparked immediate outrage from the laywoman of the house. It really goes to show that even ancient monastics dealt with intense prejudice and internal politics.
Let's pivot to Section 4, the strict ordination path, and how they protected the institution.
To manage all this internal drama and maintain public support, the institution had to get incredibly rigorous about who it actually let in. And the catalyst for these strict new guidelines was this extraordinary event. A wealthy laywoman loses her family and her wealth. Destitute, she decides to join the monastic order. Because she's finally happy and eating well, she starts putting on weight, and soon her belly grows. The other nuns, totally assuming the worst, try to expel her for breaking her vows, but she insists she was pregnant from her previous lay life, before she even joined. The Buddha actually had to intervene to protect her, recognizing she hadn't broken the monastic rules. But this near disaster highlighted a massive flaw in their onboarding process. To prevent that specific disaster from ever happening again, a highly practical training period was instituted. The safety mechanism was built directly into their timeline. First, a woman had to be a minimum of 20 years old, but before full ordination, she had to undergo a mandatory 2-year trial period as a sikhamana. And this was specifically so they could know, without a doubt, whether she was pregnant from her previous lay life or not. Only then could she become a full bhikkhuni. And on top of that, she had to wait 12 more years before she was deemed mature enough to take her own disciples. During that initial 2-year trial phase, the candidate had to strictly follow the 6 laws. And these weren't just suggestions, they were absolute deal breakers. Complete abstinence from sexual acts. No stealing, and we mean not even a single drop of oil or a thread. No killing, not even an ant, let alone a human. No lying, particularly falsely claiming spiritual achievements you definitely haven't reached. And no inappropriate physical contact with men. If a candidate slipped up and broke literally any of these, her 2-year clock completely restarted. Extreme discipline was the only way to prove readiness.
Furthermore, they got highly selective. Remember our recurring troublemaker, Thulananda? She kept ordaining literally anyone who asked, which created total chaos. Because of her mistakes, new rules were set barring specific candidates to ensure community stability. For instance, women deep in mourning were barred because they just couldn't focus on meditation. Women bringing children couldn't join because, honestly, a monastery isn't a daycare. Women with a known violently disruptive nature were rejected outright, and former prostitutes could only be ordained if they were relocated 5 to 6 yojanas, which is a massive physical distance away from their former clients, just to avoid public scandal.
And finally, Section 5, a lasting institutional blueprint. When we take a step back and really look at Volume 45, we see something profound. These texts are far, far more than just rigid religious dogmas. What we have here is a dynamic, precedent-based legal system. Every single rule we cover today, from avoiding war zones to stopping roommate disputes over a lamp to establishing a 2-year trial period, was a practical solution to a highly specific human problem. This system was meticulously designed to physically protect women, to maintain the vital trust of the lay public, and to build a resilient community that could actually survive for millennia.
Which leaves us with a pretty fascinating question to ponder. Looking at this ancient framework, the incident, the public outcry, the investigation, and the precedent, how does this method for handling community drama compare to the way we govern our modern institutions today? It's definitely something to think about. Thanks for joining me on this explainer.